Please welcome Dr. Erin Scott.
Bonsoir tout le monde, and thank you to Dr. Roy for calling me to think about participating in this evening. And it's something I'm very passionate about, aging in place housing, and have quite a lot of experience in teaching it in design studio. And I'm going to show a project night that three of us did in Nova Scotia, which was exploring the question of aging in place under a fairly critical lens. So, aging in place, most of you in the audience know this, but the question I'm asking tonight is, why is this model difficult to achieve in Canada? And it actually builds nicely, I think, on the previous two presentations. Aging in place, which you know is also known as aging at home, is the ability to live in one's own home and community safely, independently, and comfortably, regardless of age, income, and ability level. Income's an important one, and a central piece of thinking housing typology, so I'm going to focus on that. And then, of course, before I came to Sudbury, one of the projects I knew very well here in looking at CMHC and doing research on aging in place was Finlandia Village, who's just back there tonight. And their mission, as you know, is to provide quality aging in place with a continuum of care for our multicultural community. Just visiting there this past week, most of you know that the set of care that starts when you're still okay and mobile and can go to those grocery stores and drive your car changes radically as we move through different phases in aging. And all of that should still be dealt with dignity and grace, and there's a big role for architects to play in that. Now, changed. The question on the top that's a little faded says, what are the appropriate forms of housing and community for the aging population? So with Mr. Crawley, we heard several anecdotes about the kinds of experiments that happen, but from a critical point of view, it's quite sad that the shipping industry is the one that has to provide answers to housing rather than the architectural and planning and development community. So there are several factors that contribute to the lack of aging in place housing design, and that's really what this talk is focusing on, the design of housing addressing aging in place. And those, of course, we're familiar, erosion of the extended family, and that's where always we turn to the exception of ethnic groups. So in Montreal, the Greek community will live in a triplex, and the grandparents will live on the ground floor and have access. The daughter friend lives up above, and another sibling lives on top of that. But that's dense housing, it's a triplex. You can still live with autonomy, but be within a housing fabric. And in a sense, whether we look to housing in Scandinavia or Finlandia, that is the seed of that model. But the second one, dominance of the single-family dwelling house, goes against that in a significant way. And so the single-family dwelling and then the detached single-family dwelling versus multiplex dwellings, such as triplexes, duplex, continuous townhouse fabric. People that sit down and want to make a charter, like Beacon Hill in Boston, get to live in those brownstones in Boston. So that's what the image looks like that we'll see. They don't live in tract housing like Chris showed with an acre per lot or half an acre per lot. So this is a conundrum, right? It's actually essential. The housing issue and then the aging population, these two things together don't support each other. Next, the difficulty of locating services, which we all know is a key point, within the wider community. So either access to the service in those communities or bringing those services into the home. Those two things are also a challenge, especially in Canadian cities like Sudbury and Halifax, where we don't have this density. And so it's spread out and therefore becomes, as we know, all of you that have friends or family. In my own case, my mother contracted brain cancer in Toronto and trying to deal with bringing services into the house as she got increasingly ill with that was a super challenge, even as an architect. But converting a pantry into a bathroom quickly, like within a week, trying to think about services coming in, someone having 6 weeks to live, and you don't want to uproot them. The one thing I certainly share with Mr. Crowley are the two observations that everyone we ever talk to wants to stay in the house where they are. No one says, I'd like to move into that senior residence. And secondly, everyone has to have a reason to live. Whether we give that to them or whether we provide services in a community where they have a life and don't have to get uprooted, these two things are questions for us to think about together. Last point, lack of architects, designers, and developers, and I choose that word intentionally, the lack of architects putting concerted effort into the universal design of housing types that are affordable, flexible, and adaptable. And in 2004, I got very interested in this question because a young man who was 25 years old named Phil walked into Dalhousie and said, I have this piece of land and I lived in Scandinavia and I'd love to do some aging in place housing, so can you look at this together? And Niall Savage, another architect colleague at Dalhousie, we took that on. We read much of the CMHC literature. There were lots of reports. We applied for a $25,000 grant. We got it easily on one-page letter, kind of saying we're going to look into this, because when I started looking across the country at the models of aging in place, outside of Finlandia, there was one in Ottawa called the Meridian Center Point that you may or may not know of. So those are intentionally designed aging in place communities, but aside from that, there was a library of material, but not a library of housing examples that we could point to. So this started us looking at the question of designing it with students, and we'll come to that. So some key factors, you know that baby boomers, as we said, are born between 1947 and 66. So now, when I did that project in 2004, they were in their 50s, now they're 66. 38% of the population of Sudbury is 50 plus, that's out of this evening's material. In the US, the population of 60 or more has moved from 43 million in 2005 to an estimated 73 million by 2020. And in Canada, an increase of 71% there means that we need a lot more people than the odd rogue developer kind of coming up with things that we're not providing. So that doesn't answer the larger question of a housing typology to think about. The next, somewhere between 78 and 80% of people interviewed between the ages of 50 to 64, and you could extend that report. Of course, they prefer to stay in their current residences as they age, but how to achieve this in a housing stock that is not easily adaptable poses the huge architectural design issue. Lastly, the 2 points, an increasingly aging population means that the pyramid will quickly become inverted, and Chris just showed that nicely with male, female as well added to that in terms of the age increasing in the next 20 years. And then naturally occurring retirement communities called NORCs and certified aging in place specialists called CAPS are indicators of a growing field in the relationship of geriatrics, aging in place, increased service, and so on. But again, I would say as an architect, the housing market has not responded to that. So, Finlandia Village we know, we're proud of because it's in Sudbury and it's a national model in housing. The one below, Beacon Hill, that Mr. Crawley mentioned, is Beacon Hill Village. I just visited there last week. I was in Boston for another conference, and I always go by to see how that place is doing. Finlandia, I think, is 1982 begun. Boston started that one in 1999. But again, it's a good model. It's worth studying, but it's fairly affluent people in Boston. It's not affordable housing. It's not for people that can't afford services. It's a bunch of baby boomer yuppies that were characterized that decided to take care of themselves because people weren't doing it for them. If you have money, fine. If you don't have money, it's a question for us as a school of architecture and a group in the community. And then the village concept, which came out of Beacon Hill Village, the bottom image, they've written a founder's manual. There's over 70 groups that then have read that manual and tried to found a village for themselves. And of course, we all know the adages of it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to support seniors. The concept of village is there at multiple levels, which used to be what fabric was like when we had extended families and dense housing types and people lived together. So these two things, the metaphor of the village we come back to, is now on the top. This Kensington Lodge Village, the one, it's missing a heading. Oh, it's very faint on the top. That top right image is that building in Ottawa called the Meridian from 1999 again. So it's interesting that those are already 14, 15 years old. And in Canada, I can't name another dozen models of housing design for aging in place that addresses things with dignity and with grace. So, Kensington Lodge then was this, as I say, this fellow Phil came in with a piece of land and we started looking into the concept of what is it when people want to live together. So the village green or the commons was the metaphor for the way people wanted to live within this dignity and grace model, and that aging in place through a proactive wellness model could make all the difference in the world if you were near transit, as Chris said, if you had services, and then if you could bring those services into the complex. So several of the things, and these were images we showed to talk to the population of Halifax we had money to do focus groups between 55, actually every 10 years, 55 to 65, 65 to 75, and 75 to 85. And we sat and we talked about these kinds of images. Terrace gardens, but this piece of land was on a slope, and in a kind of Scandinavian way, people said, of course, it's not a problem, or Laurentian campus, to walk this slope in January, with your groceries. So that was one. Italian hill towns, of course, people spoke about, but I said Halifax is not an Italian hill town. It rains horizontally there, and you had to develop a new kind of wall because of that condition, so that's not Italy. But the imagery of the kind of garden, health, being able to walk, a welcome and drop-off center is what people talked about on this piece of land that gave orientation for people when they were visiting. There was also a kind of lounge, and that made a lot of sense because there was an existing house on the property. And like Finlandia, again, one of the buildings there, the image of a kind of Nordic house, Finnish house, in this case a Halifax clapboard house, made familiar image of house, which is the other recurring metaphor, rather than institution or hospital, retirement home. People were saying house was an important image. And so things like this, the dining hall as a gathering hall and place of collective celebration, these were images we were showing from active communities, common rooms for a variety of activities, and not having just a jacuzzi, pool, gym like a condo or a co-op would, but trying to think about a series of common rooms that were decentralized throughout the building, the complex of buildings, so that, again, baby boomers have a different set of activities. So people said, we want to have a yoga room, we want to have a place where we can have a library, we want to have an internet lounge because people said we like still working out of the apartment, but I'd rather go to a place. Students go to Starbucks, they wanted to go to a lounge in the complex, right, to separate work from leisure. So these were issues that we were gathering to kind of come up with a program for a building. The gathering hall then, they said maybe connected with a lounge in this renovated house, which was the Kensington Lodge piece, where residents could gather for conversation. We said guest rooms then for family and friends could be upstairs, and that was the proposal to renovate the house so that when you were visiting someone, you could stay there. Then again, for Sudbury, like Halifax, the notion of a screened porch, like an interior street where residents could occupy and put furniture and be outside and look at views and be in the gardens. These were all images that they had either come from in houses, or we could all see how that could be like an internal street, and unlike a corridor in an apartment block or in a hospital, that it was lit from one side, had views, and you still say there are two corridors if you look at a plan, but it's a very different set of imageries to come up with this. And then images for walkways, back of Beacon Hill or Back Bay, back of Montreal Lanes, where there's a kind of layering of gardens and balconies and density so that, children can still sit down there and be proximate. So many years ago, I've always thought, senior housing and daycares make sense in some way to not silo everything and start putting them back together because they're together in a village or in a neighborhood. So this was another very important one. In Halifax, Mount St. Vincent University has a gerontology department quite established, and so therapy gardens, they were quite excited about having people do internships or stage with the therapy gardens and be into the complex that was 17 townhouses. So that would be 51 units. And then greenhouses for winter gardening, barrier-free, being able to wheel up to the gardens and get access to them. This is the image of a kind of terrace garden with the commons rather than just a small plot on your balcony. Gazebos, that was one we argued a lot with Niall. Niall thought gazebos were kind of non-modern architecture, but I said everybody loves gazebos like this. And so we were saying a gazebo was actually a place for people to go to a destiny in a garden and being able to walk up to this ravine, which was at the top of the 2-acre piece of land. So this was a sketch then of the original idea of a highway. There was a bus stop right here, which was perfect. There was a house existing, and then this was the partie, the diagram, to think about this long park with a big slope going up the hill. And the village commons idea was to create a set of units that was around a common grass, looking up towards the harbor view. And this house here is the image of the house that he bought that could be the first encounter when you pull off the road. And then a welcome center here. And like in an Italian hill town, the notion that you could walk up when you were healthy, but if you actually needed to, we eventually put elevator cores in 3 places to be able to go up to several levels, and then you'd walk really an outside street, so that's the piece that would get screened as a porch. So it was village and community with the notion of choice, and you'll notice things like this. Every unit had corner windows where you could see out and out onto the common street, which there were 3 levels of. And many interesting things happen in cases like that. People between 55 and 65 said, I love the notion of street. I want to do my dishes and be in the front here and be able to talk to people going by. People 65 to 75 said, the hell with that. I don't want to sit on the street and be forced to interact I'd like a balcony because I want a barbecue in the back in my pajamas, and that was, you're taking notes, right? And then people 75 to 85 again said, you know, I'm lonely, people are dying, my friends are going, I'd like to sit back out on that street. So that was interesting, right? 3 focus groups, they're all seniors, but the variation between them was as much as between any of us in the room. So those were the kind of things that then we ended up putting balconies on the back, still keeping the street, but then that was about giving people choice, right? So it wasn't just everybody had to do the same thing. So that developed into this piece of the Welcome Center. 17 triplex units moving around, but again, even these ones, everyone got a view. There was a garden here. The roofs of them, because they were stacked on the hill, became green roofs for others, for therapy gardens. And then this path went up into this very deep park and ravine, which the people that were choosing to live there really said they wanted this lifestyle as long as they could maintain, of walking and being able to be fit and then jump on the bus and be able to get downtown to Halifax. So 18 houses, 3 stories each, and the Welcome Center. That's how it looked in section. This was all a design development to try to see, was there an interesting market? And Phil, even though he was 25 years old, he had a very clear idea that this wasn't just one-off. He wanted us to study it as a type, so that then, like a Georgian townhouse type that people know from London that goes around the world, as a section, gets light into the basement, half up off the street. He was interested and asked us, can this become a type that could get repeated in different situations across Canada? And that was where it was researched. So this staggered up the hill. Parking below was a proposition about being able to just get rid of the cars again and hide them rather than have to have it take up all the surface of the park on the ground. But that Welcome Center would be a building that anchored, and then as the building stepped up, you could go into parking and come up onto this level, walk along, and then as it stepped up again, you'd have to take another elevator if you lived up on the top. So not all the elevators went to the parking. This was the screen porch idea of having a, that's where you could put in storm windows and kind of close it in inclement weather, open it up in good weather, and everybody had a colored door, a big window. They could do their dishes in the kitchen in the front that you'll see in a minute, and then they could have the chance to encounter each other on these walkways. That plan is faint, so I've blown it up on the next image, but it's just to show you here that this is the idea. This was an outdoor walkway that people could take. An elevator core was there, and the next one shows it better. For the plan, our real research in housing with Niall and Phil was to see that these units all have a front door, a kitchen in the front where you had sinks and could talk to people on the porch, a dining and a living area that was together that felt open, a hearth with a storage in the hearth, a Murphy bed that could pull out of the wall for extra sleeping, and at the back, this could be a bedroom and a den, or you could take this partition wall out and have it be a large bedroom and an office, or both could be closed and this could be turned into a second bedroom. So with that, the real important piece of this design was to look at these numbers. 1 bedroom and a den, you would think is small when you look at a condo market even up the street from where I'm living now and see that they're looking at them at 1,200 square feet. It was the same number. Everybody in Halifax said, we live now in 1,200 square feet. Why would I ever move into 600 square feet? So that was the research. It wasn't to say it's just half the price, but you can see single loaded, there's not a dark place, ventilation and air was on both sides, a front porch and a rear balcony, and then a core for a bathroom, and then a master bathroom in here, all in. This one is a 2-bedroom plus the den, so that was 912. 2-bedroom only, we got down by almost 100 square feet, and the 1-bedroom in the den was 670 square feet. That was the piece of the research that I would carry forward to today, because they were small units, but the number game that we were showing was that with those sizes, you actually had 53% of that was your unit, and 47% of the complex was the common space, including that porch. So by the time you add a yoga room, 8 of those rooms throughout the complex, if you included all of that common space and your unit and said that's where I live, that 100% suddenly doubled your real estate, but you're paying for the unit. So that was the number. Phil wanted to build it. He wasn't just a philanthropist. So we were doing that research to say you could sell your 1,200 square foot condo, you could buy these. We had 3 meetings and we had pre-sold 30 of the 54 units on a meeting and a half. And then the city of Halifax said they wouldn't build it because of a bylaw glitch. And that was frustrating as hell, because for 2.5 years we'd done this work. We had seen there was certainly a supply and demand. There was a market, people were interested, and they wouldn't rezone it from a gas station lot to be able to do multiple residential. On the other hand, Phil had the right to build 18 McMansions on that same piece of land. So there's the irony that starts us as architects to really say, let's take this on, argue it through. But in the case of being here now in Sudbury, with things like the bylaws that allow us to have whatever we want to call granny flats, multiple housing, being able to adjust your house, those are really positive things to work with the city. But at the end, we got stuck and it didn't get built because of this one bylaw that they wouldn't be moving on, even though the city of Halifax had done their master plan the year before, and all the keywords of choice and community and density and revitalization and being downtown, they were all in the plan. This met almost all of those, but at the end, we didn't get it built. But I think the key point here is that 53% of the building is your dwelling and 47% of common space meant that you had corner windows, a hearth, light, and all of this other place in the building to be able to share. And those key elements then was a unique Nordic style because of the density and the community. It's really a social diagram which doesn't map on so much with our notion of the single family dwelling. It catered to the needs of the adults between 55 and 75. It combined unique housing and programs to allow for aging in place. It converted the existing house to a community dining hall, which meant people felt at home in the house. It had a community based on the proactive wellness model versus the typical medical model, not here where we are, but in Halifax, the gerontology department was quite clear to say, people are ill and then we deal with them to be treated, whereas aging in place really inverts that philosophy. Continual access through village, promoting socialization and potential encounter. Integrating the buildings with the landscape, the healing gardens and other therapeutic elements, and then having views, that's particular to the project, having views of the basin, sharing the 100-acre park, and integrating the village and the greater community to complement each other for services, because it gave a whole set of services then to the community. So if I take a look at that, but I say the reality was good piece of research, very useful still for us, but that particular time didn't get built. Here, Dan asked me about the School of Architecture to draw a parallel in closing. I think those issues of the social and choice and dignity are in all projects all the time. And as we're developing the plans for the school with Levitt Goodman, there are some interesting parallels, and one is the notion of village here. We have the 4 buildings with a courtyard where people will gather and things will get built. We have something like a student lounge, which is like the yoga room in that project that is seen from the street and is accessible and all on grade. We have things like this room as the drawing room, which will really be where people will see activity on Elm Street. And in a certain way, the philosophy runs through this project as well. Here, this piece is a kind of civic garden of the Elgin Greenway that will allow people, to cycle through, to walk through, to stop and have lunch. That image you've probably seen, which shows that kind of spirit of having some of it's more green than paved, but stopping, being able to sit, and then having this be a civic access. All of those principles, I think, are similar in both projects in terms of how we create community, and architects are really about that notion. And so I think the notion of affordable and senior and baby boomer housing, they have to be really rethought quite radically if we're going to come up with typologies that make sense for all of us, and not just be stuck at a certain stage and frustrated that you're either in the wrong kind of density, or you're not near the services, or you suddenly have a stroke. As a friend had last week, someone has a stroke, and at 40, they're in a house that they won't be able to function anymore. So they pick up the phone and call and say, what do we do? That's the position we don't want to be in as a design community. So thank you.